Is that good?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So aloha, everybody. My name is Rachel Kingsley. I am the Hawaiian Forest Bird Education and Outreach Associate for both the ʻAlalā project and recently joined the Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project as well. Just a little bit about me. I joined the ʻAlalā project in 2017. Prior to that, I had worked at the conservation breeding program for Hawaii endangered birds, which is run by San Diego Zoo Global. So I've been working with ʻAlalā since 2008. So they're near and dear to my heart. So I'm going to hopefully share some information that I have about them with you all today. And hopefully you can leave the presentation knowing a little bit about ʻAlalā, as well as what our conservation partnership project is doing to work on the conservation of this amazing species. So first and foremost, the ʻAlalā, they are a member of the corvid family. So they are related to crows, ravens, magpies, jays, which people might be familiar with on the mainland. They are one of 5 endemic corvid species that were once found here within the Hawaiian Islands, which I'll touch on in just a second. But a little bit about the ʻAlalā, they weigh about 1 pound. They are about 1.5 feet measured from the tip of their beak to the end of their tail. So they are a large black bird that is native here. For many years, people were trying to figure out where the ʻAlalā came from, or maybe who they were most closely related to then guess where these birds originated from. And there was a study done in 2012 showing that through genetic samples that these birds were actually most commonly or most closely related genetically to the rook, which is found throughout Europe and Asia. So the theory is that at some point, some rooks got blown off course, maybe from somewhere in Asia, found their way here to the Hawaiian Islands and evolved into what we have as the ʻAlalā today. Now, I mentioned that these birds are one of 5 endemic corvid species. The corvids were found throughout the Hawaiian Islands. All of the other corvid species have gone extinct except for the ʻAlalā. And the ʻAlalā are technically considered extinct in the wilds, but they're not completely gone yet, which is something really important. Historically, these birds were found most recently found on the Big Island of Hawaii, and you can see that in this dark blue shaded area. The birds would go from about 1,000 feet in elevation up to about 8,000 feet in elevation. And what they were doing moving between that elevational gradient was really following the fruits of the forest. So if you think about corvid species, most people think of them as scavengers. ʻAlalā are a little bit different. They are an omnivore, so they'll eat a little bit of everything, but they rely really heavily on the native fruits of the forest. These birds have a really special relationship with the hoʻava, this picture down in the bottom left-hand corner. The hoʻava is actually a fairly large fruit with a really hard outside shell. ʻAlalā are really one of the only species that can break into this hoʻava seed or fruit and get the seeds out of the inside. Now, their role in the Hawaiian forest is that of a seed disperser. So if we think about, there's some really juicy fruits up here, the ʻAlalā eat it, they'll fly away. Unlike us, they don't scoop their seeds out of their papayas while they're eating their fruits. So they fly away, they leave those digested seeds in the form of their fecals and help plant the forests as they go throughout the forest landscape. So we talk a lot about, one native species, the ʻAlalā. Why is it so important to save this one species? They're teetering on the brink of extinction, but why should we save just this one species? Well, we talk about it. If you think about the whole forest ecosystem as a big puzzle, we're talking about one piece of the puzzle. And if we can put that one piece of the puzzle back, we actually help restore healthy mauka or upland forests, which then help provide plentiful natural resources for all of us. So it's not all just about one species. We're actually helping restore parts of the puzzle to actually help plentiful resources for all of us. Now, the story of ʻAlalā is kind of a sad one. We know that throughout in time, there was historical documents written about ʻAlalā. In the 1800s, there were up to hundreds of ʻAlalā seen at a time throughout their historic range. But as time passed on, we started to see less and less of these birds. By 1976, there was only 76 individuals within the wild population. By 1992, there was only 13. As this population started to decrease, there was 9 individuals that were gathered from the wild population to start a conservation breeding program. Without that breeding program, we would have no ʻAlalā with us today, and I wouldn't be here talking about this awesome bird. Because the last wild pair was seen on Hawaii Island in 2002 in the South Kona district. Now, some reasons for why these birds started to disappear are things such as introduced predators, cats, rats, and mongoose, as well as introduced diseases such as avian pox and avian malaria, which are transmitted by mosquitoes. But then also these birds are highly susceptible to toxoplasmosis, which is also carried by cats within their feces. And then as well as habitat loss. And really, we can't tease apart one of these threats as a higher threat to these individuals. All of these things kind of came onto the landscape right around the same time. And with everything happening around the same time, these birds really just couldn't have the time to evolve what they needed to in order to survive all of the changes. But we're not all about losing hope here. So in 2016, we actually started releasing birds back out into the forest on Hawaii Island, which I'll talk a little bit more about towards the end of the project or presentation, sorry. So what about their natural predator? We touched on introduced predators being cats, rats, and mongoose. Well, the ʻAlalā do have one natural predator, which is the ʻEo, or the Hawaiian hawk. The ʻEo and the ʻAlalā have a really special relationship. So we know that this is a predator of these birds, but this is not one of the reasons why these birds was really, the populations were declining as drastically as they were. At some point, they had a healthy balance within the forest and they were both able to coexist out there together. But it is something interesting to keep in mind. So the ʻAlalā are a really special species. They're an aumakua here in the Hawaiian culture. Their dark color can represent ana ana, or the Hawaiian dark magic, or kind of just the unknown. The name ʻAlalā, if you were to look it up in the dictionary, translates to a style of chanting, a messenger who would be calling out the chief's commands during battles, as well as the cry of a baby. So their name, if you look it up by definition, it talks about this loud voice, and these guys definitely have a very loud, distinct, unique voice in the forest. They have a wide variety of calls. There's a scientist that was studying some of the calls, and they were teasing apart over 30 unique different calls that these birds use to communicate with each other, which is pretty amazing. So a little bit about the reintroduction efforts for the ʻAlalā. So the ʻAlalā project is a conservation partnership made up of 3 main entities, which are San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, the State of Hawaii's Division of Forestry and Wildlife under the Department of Land and Natural Resources, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And on Hawaii Island, we partnered with Kamehameha Schools, National Park Service, Three Mountain Alliance, USGS, as well as the Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit. And together we all started coming up with a plan and working together to kind of use our strengths to help carry out the reintroduction efforts of these birds and bringing them back to the wild. So in order to move forward with releasing birds, we first need the birds. So through the conservation breeding program, like I mentioned, this is run by San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. This program started in the 1970s and has grown over time. They started with 9 individuals brought in from the wild population. And over time, they've grown to over 100 ʻAlalā within the conservation breeding population. So when the program first started, it was really about get as many of these birds as we possibly can. So efforts were taken to artificially incubate and hand rear the young. These birds are very intelligent and they will imprint on whatever they see. So whatever, when they open their eyes, whatever they see, they think is mom and dad. So we would take some pretty drastic measures to cover ourselves up and use puppets for feeding. Now, since the population is growing, instead of focusing on kind of quantity of birds, we're looking at quality of birds. So how can the program produce the best release candidates possible? So these steps have actually changed, and they're now allowing all of the adults to do the parent rearing of the juveniles, hoping to produce better release individuals for future releases. So once we have the birds, the next step to look at is where can we release these birds and what has the best habitat suitable for the birds to survive in the wild. So back in 2012, I believe, was the first scopings, site scoping visits on the Hawaii island, looking at different potential release areas for ʻAlalā. During those site scoping visits, Puʻumaka'ala Natural Area Reserve was chosen as kind of the best fit for what the birds needed at that time. So beginning in 2016, we were utilizing Puʻumaka'ala, which, if you're familiar with Hawaii Island, we're on the slopes of Mauna Loa, kind of on the Hilo side, more around Mountain View area. So kind of tucked up in the mountains. We have really healthy natural forests. It's about 18,000 acres of land that is owned by the state of Hawaii and managed. It is fenced off and ungulate free, so the forest has had a really good time or chance to develop the things that the ʻAlalā would need in order to survive. So when carrying out reintroductions of wildlife, there's kind of two main thoughts of how to go about releasing these birds. So there's a soft release process and a hard release process. The hard release process is really just taking them from the conservation breeding facility and opening the door and letting them out into the wild and wishing them luck. So we wanted to make sure that, the birds are having the best chance at survival that they possibly could. So we took the soft release process, which has a few more steps involved. But again, really wanting to make sure that these birds had the best chance at survival. With the first step of our soft release process is taking them from the conservation breeding facility, to Puʻumaka'ala, where we had developed a flight conditioning aviary. In this aviary, it's a semi-permanent structure made kind of out of a greenhouse frame. So we've kind of just tweaked it to what we would need to house the birds. The birds were housed in here for about 2 months. We had staff going up and checking on them every day. In this flight conditioning aviary, it was big enough where the birds could start to build up the muscles that they would need to make long distance flights, for avoiding, EOs or finding food. We were taking care of them, and if they became sick, we could recapture them in this kind of wooden structure. It's a little hard to see in this photo, but there's like a little wooden box in here that we call a hack box. The birds are fed in here, so they're used to coming in, and there's a sliding door on the backside. So if we needed to recapture the birds for any sort of reason, we could get them to come in here and slide the door shut behind them and have a really good opportunity to get them in hand if absolutely necessary. But really, this is the first chance that these birds got to really acclimate to the new surroundings. So the weather's a little bit different, the rain's a little bit different. They could come in contact with mosquitoes in this aviary because it's not covered by mosquito mesh at all. So it's really their chance to start, acclimating to their new digs. During this time, also the 2 months that they were in the flight conditioning aviary, we were also supplementally feeding these birds, and we wanted to supplementally feed the birds throughout a good chunk of the release process so that we could really, again, give these birds, the best fighting chance at survival that we could possibly give them. So they were trained to come down to these little kind of green hopper stands, which we had in the flight conditioning aviary, but then we also moved out into the forest once we released the birds as well. And we could use these stands to not only get them to come back to the aviary if we needed to for whatever reason. But we could also kind of guide their movements throughout the forest if we wanted them to find a new spot where maybe there was a lot of good native resources, or maybe if there was birds that were getting territorial with each other, we could move hopper stands, encouraging other birds to move throughout the forest and away from the territorial birds that were happening. Also, with these hopper stands in this far right picture, there's a scale incorporated into one of the stands. So we would set up these stands with the scale, and then we'd have a trail camera attached to a tree nearby. So that allowed us a really good and easy way to kind of monitor the health of the birds. So the birds would come down, they'd land on the scale, we'd be able to get a photo with the band combination that each one of these birds is wearing, as well as the weight. So we could kind of monitor them without actually having to be out in the forest tracking them around and disturbing them. So each one of the birds throughout the entire release process was wearing a radio transmitter on what we refer to as their birdie backpacks. So it's a little harness system that goes across their chest and around their wings. It doesn't bother them at all. And each one of the little radio transmitters would emit a unique signal that we could pick up through a handheld GPS or tracking device. And utilizing GPS points, we could then track them throughout the forest and kind of map out their movements. This was important for us to learn as much information about the birds as we possibly could, which then can help inform future release efforts, as well as figure out, what resources each of these birds were utilizing, what they felt that they needed in order to survive, and just really gathering as much information as we possibly could with, using fairly low tech technology. So from the flight conditioning aviary, we moved the birds into release aviaries. So these are temporary structures that were built according to the release site. So in 2016, we built it up on stilts, and the other ones were built on the ground. And we tried to incorporate the natural vegetation with making as little impact as we possibly could. Since after the releases, each one of these structures was taken down. So they're lightweight aluminum frame panels that we could put up, take down, move through the forest, etc. So we have all of the infrastructure for our release that led us to the 2016 releases. So in December of 2016, we released 5 individuals. They were all male. The plan was to always get a second group of birds out, but we never quite got there. So after the first week of the releases, we unfortunately lost 3 birds. 3 of them passed away. So that told us that something wasn't quite right in our release strategy. And we wanted to keep moving forward because the whole goal of our project is to get these birds out and establishing a wild population of ʻAlalā in the wild. So the difficult decision was made to pull the 2 remaining birds back in to the conservation breeding program and kind of reevaluate what we were doing and look at what we could change to then keep moving forward. So the bodies of the birds were recovered. We were able to do kind of an autopsy, which is called, for animals, it's a necropsy. 2 of the birds were passed away by EO predation, and 1 passed away from, he kind of got lost in this big storm, got blown off course, and then couldn't find his way back, and unfortunately didn't make it. So that told us a few things about our release strategy. So we went back to the drawing board and changed 3 major things. One was looking at our cohort composition and size. So these birds are territorial and can be dominant and aggressive with each other, especially males. So we really wanted to release groups of birds that were really a cohesive unit. So that kind of buddy system, like I got your back, you got my back, So we looked at the birds that we were releasing in 2017. We released 11 birds. We split them into 2 groups just based off of the size of the release aviary. So we didn't want to overcrowd or stress anybody out. Moving forward, we had a similar release strategy in 2018, and then in 2019, we had to change things a little bit because the birds were a little bit older. So the first 2 years, 2017 and 2018, we were releasing about 1-year-old birds. 2019, they were about 2 years old. So a little bit older, that we started seeing a few issues with aggression. So we split them up even more. The next big thing that we started looking at is the site selection itself, and we used a quantitative analysis to look at the site selection for each one of the release sites. And through that, we determined that we were releasing in areas that maybe weren't the best. So we found new sites to release the birds in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And then the third big change was looking at the anti-predator training, and we developed a new anti-predator training by working with the Puerto Rican Parrot Project, who is working with a kind of a similar strategy of releasing birds. The birds there, the Puerto Rican parrots that they're releasing, have a similar hawk predator. And so we use some of their techniques and kind of tweak them to what our birds would need here in Hawaii. So through those changes, when we did the releases, we were seeing some positive things. So when we first released the birds, they all stuck fairly close to the release area. Within the first week, they started, moving around about 100 meters, but they would return kind of to their home base, which is the release aviary itself. Over time, they started exploring more and more of the forest habitat around the aviary, which was really exciting. And then we even had some birds going off on these really long distance flights and exploring new forest areas. Again, most often coming back to kind of near that initial release site, which is kind of what we expected. Through our supplemental training or supplemental feeding, we fed the birds this kind of artificial diet, which is what they get at the conservation breeding facility. This is based off of nutritional needs that the birds have. So we are trying to mimic their natural diet without depleting all of the natural resources that are found within the release area. So we didn't want to go out and pick all the native fruits so that they couldn't find them when they were out foraging for themselves. Also, it's very time intensive to feed multiple birds that way. So we did what we could with an artificial diet and mimicked the nutrients needed as best we could. So we'd prepare this, we'd weigh it every morning. We'd go out and we'd divide it up into the little hopper stands, and then we'd gather it at night, weigh it again, and then that way we could track how much supplemental food they were using out in the release site. We'd also wanted to limit our impact on the forest, and we didn't want to do things like feed rodents. So that was another big reason why we were gathering the food back at night. So through our release efforts, we saw some really positive milestones with our birds. Unfortunately, so I'm kind of getting a little ahead of myself, but unfortunately in 2020, we started losing more and more of our birds. So unfortunately, we had to make the really difficult decision. As all of the partners came together, we made the decision to gather the remaining 5 birds that were left. So throughout the 3 releases from 2017 to 2019, we had released 27 birds. Unfortunately, we only had 5 left. So again, something wasn't quite right with the strategies that we were using. Throughout that 3-year release period, we had some really encouraging milestones. So in 2018, we actually saw the formation of multiple pairs of birds. These birds are known to mate for life. So they build very strong pair bonds with each other. And once they form that pair bond, it's really hard to break it unless one of the birds dies. So in 2018, we had 2 pairs form that actually started to build nests. One pair, she started building a nest, she sat on it for a day and then kind of gave up, which is not uncommon with young birds, kind of testing the waters, trying to figure out what they need to do. The other pair, we were never able to really determine if they had eggs or not, but from the monitoring that we could do, we believe that she had eggs in her nest and she sat for a full incubation term, which is really exciting. So we don't know if there were eggs or not. We never saw any signs of hatching or, anything like that. So if she did have eggs, they could have been infertile. Again, not uncommon with these birds for first-time pairs, but that was the first ʻAlalā nest in the wild in over 20 years, which was really encouraging. Also, the birds that were released in 2017 all lived for over a year in the wild. So those birds had found enough resources to help kind of maintain them out in the wild with the amount of supplemental feeding that we were also doing. But they were starting to learn some really important lessons, and we saw some really encouraging things like them finding and eating native fruits and helping scatter those throughout the forest, as well as the possible breeding attempts. So I have a short video of some of the birds out in the wild. There's one bird down here at one of the supplemental feeding stations, but if you keep an eye out, you'll see more birds up in the forest. So again, these are juvenile birds that we were releasing. They're at about 1 year old. They reach sexual maturity at about 2 years of age, between 2 to 4 years. So when they're juveniles, they'll kind of stick around in these big kind of gangs or cohorts with each other. And then over time, they'll start to gradually kind of separate from the rest of the flock and build those strong pair bonds with their potential mate. So these are still youngsters, but really cool to see them interacting with the native forest, and really that forest just completely changed with the voice of the ʻAlalā back in it again. So why am I talking about ʻAlalā? Aren't they just a Big Island species? Well, the project's next steps is really, after the regathering the birds in 2020, something's not quite right. And unfortunately, we can't figure out exactly how to get the EO and the ʻAlalā to interact peacefully with each other in the forests here on Hawaii Island. So the next step for the ʻAlalā project is we're actually looking at coming and bringing the ʻAlalā somewhere within Maui Nui. So the next step, the next release is going to be somewhere within Maui Nui. So Molokai, Maui, we're really looking at, all of the options that we have. So in the future, there's a good chance that you will be seeing ʻAlalā somewhere within Maui Nui. And really, we feel comfortable with doing this because through fossil evidence, we do know that there was a corvid species at one point within Maui. So really, we're trying to help bring back that ecological role that this bird played within the forests at some point, and it's been missing for many, many years. Again, we're in the very, very, very beginning stages of the planning process. So there's no sites chosen yet, but it is something that we are working on, and hopefully sometime in the future, we will have more updates about what our next steps or where we might be. But I just wanted to say mahalo for attending today and kind of learning about our spooky ʻAlalā for your ha'alala ween. I know that's a really bad pun, but if you have any questions, I think we have some time to still take them. Otherwise, you can reach out to us online. Our email's up there, and you can also follow us on social media as well. All right, now stop sharing. All right, are there questions?
I don't know if I just got these directly or if they were sent what are the ʻAlalā eating? Like what's at the eating stand and how heavy is their backpack?
So what is in the supplemental food? So in the very bottom of the container, there's some fruits and vegetables in there. So like some melon and papaya and that kind of stuff. But also there are bird pellets that are specially formulated for birds. It's not Chex Mix. It is kind of like if you think about what you would feed your dog or your cat, it's specially formulated pelleted food that meets all of their nutritional needs. So it's special just for birds. A lot of island bird species are really good at storing iron in their diets, and it's something that we have to keep in mind when making an artificial diet. If the bird's bodies have too much iron, they'll actually get these like crystals in their muscles, and it can cause major health issues. So we have to be really careful as to what we're feeding them. Out in the wild, they wouldn't be finding as much iron just because it's not as readily available. So it's not Chex Mix. It is definitely bird food that is specially formulated for them. Yeah, are there other ones? Could the ʻAlalā possibly have a negative impact on other forest birds on Maui? Short answer, yes, they could, but longer answer on that is we are taking that into account. So when we look at the site that we're going to choose to release these birds within Maui Nui, that is something that we are going to look very carefully into. We have a big, long quantitative process where we are analyzing the different sites. And one of those things is going to be looking into how the birds will interact or affect the place that we're putting them into. So. All right, are there any other questions?
Wow. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
Very exciting stuff. Well, I'll have to stay tuned. And Rachel will be giving the general Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project presentation at our next Maui Mauka Conservation Awareness Training, which is on November 9th, if I'm correct. And you guys will have to sign up for that one at maui.mauka.org/trainings.